In the rigid hierarchy of military life, where rank determines everything from where you sit to who speaks first, there are unwritten rules that everyone follows without question. Lower enlisted personnel don't challenge officers. Base security guards stay in their lane. And when a general enters the room, everyone else becomes invisible. But sometimes, just sometimes, those rules get shattered by someone who refuses to accept that their voice doesn't matter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been stationed at Fort Braxton for 18 months, and in all that time, she'd learned to navigate the complex social ecosystem of military life with quiet precision. At 26, she was older than many of her peers when she enlisted, having spent 4 years working dead-end jobs after high school before deciding the military might offer her the structure and purpose she'd been searching for. What she discovered was a world where your last name on your uniform carried more weight than your first name ever would, and where the opinions of an E5 base security specialist were rarely solicited and even more rarely valued. The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday at the sprawling North Carolina installation. Rodriguez clocked in at 0530 hours, grabbed her radio and security roster from the duty sergeant, and began her rounds of the perimeter checkpoints. Fort Braxton housed nearly 40,000 personnel across its vast expanse, from fresh-faced privates learning their first military occupational specialties to seasoned colonels managing multi-million-dollar operations. As base security, Rodriguez's job was to be simultaneously invisible and omnipresent, there when needed, unnoticed when not. She'd grown accustomed to being overlooked. When visiting dignitaries toured the facility, security personnel were expected to blend into the background like living furniture. During briefings and meetings, she was the silent guardian at the door, present but not participating. It wasn't personal, she'd learned. It was simply the way the system worked. The machine of military bureaucracy had its gears, and people like Rodriguez were the oil that kept things running smoothly. Essential, but rarely acknowledged. But Rodriguez had always been different, even as a child growing up in East Los Angeles. Her mother, Carmen, had raised 3 children on her own after her husband died in a construction accident, and she'd instilled in each of them a fierce sense of self-worth that couldn't be diminished by circumstances. "Mija," she would tell Maria, "your voice matters, not because of where you sit, but because of what you have to say. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words had echoed in Rodriguez's mind through countless moments when she'd bitten her tongue, swallowed her observations, and maintained the professional silence expected of her rank. The base had been buzzing with unusual activity for the past week. Word had filtered down through the chain of command that they would be receiving a high-profile visit from General Patricia Hawthorne, a 3-star general known throughout the Army for her strategic brilliance and her reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense with surgical precision. General Hawthorne was conducting a comprehensive review of base operations as part of a larger Pentagon initiative to optimize resource allocation and improve operational efficiency across all installations. For most personnel, this meant extra duties, extended inspections, and the kind of heightened attention to detail that made everyone slightly more stressed than usual. For Rodriguez, it meant longer shifts and more vigilant monitoring of access points, ensuring that every visitor was properly screened and every protocol was followed to the letter. She'd heard stories about General Hawthorne from other bases, how she had a reputation for asking unexpected questions, for seeking input from personnel at all levels, and for making decisions that sometimes shocked the establishment but invariably proved effective. The general was scheduled to arrive on Thursday for a 3-day comprehensive review that would include facility tours, operational briefings, and what the official itinerary described as stakeholder consultations. Rodriguez knew that last term was military speak for meetings with officers and senior NCOs whose opinions would help shape the general's final recommendations. As a staff sergeant in base security, she wouldn't be part of those consultations. Her role would be to ensure the general's safety and facilitate her movement around the installation, nothing more. What Rodriguez couldn't have known was that her routine Tuesday morning patrol would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she understood about her place in the military hierarchy. As she conducted her standard security sweep of Building 7, the installation's primary administrative complex, she noticed something that made her pause. It was subtle, the kind of detail that most people would overlook, but that her trained eye caught immediately. The building housed the base's financial operations, human resources, and several classified planning offices. Access was strictly controlled, with multiple checkpoints and verification protocols. But as Rodriguez reviewed the previous night's security logs, she noticed an irregularity in the entry patterns that didn't match the official duty roster. Someone with high-level clearance had accessed the building during off hours, but their signature was missing from the required documentation. It could have been an administrative oversight, or it could have been something more serious. Protocol dictated that she report the discrepancy to her immediate supervisor, who would investigate and file the appropriate paperwork. In 99 cases out of 100, that's exactly what would happen. The irregularity would be noted, explained away as a clerical error, and filed in a folder that would gather dust until the next routine inspection. But something about this particular discrepancy nagged at Rodriguez in a way that previous irregularities hadn't.
Rodriguez spent the rest of her Tuesday morning shift trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right about what she'd discovered. The missing signature belonged to Colonel James Morrison, the base's deputy operations officer, a man whose reputation for rigid adherence to protocol made the oversight particularly puzzling. In her 18 months at Fort Braxton, Rodriguez had never known Morrison to deviate from proper procedure, let alone fail to complete required documentation. As she walked her next security round, Rodriguez's mind kept returning to the timing of Morrison's late-night visit to Building 7. According to the electronic access log, he'd entered at 21:47 hours on Monday evening and exited at 22:03 hours, just 16 minutes inside. That was barely enough time to retrieve a file or conduct a brief meeting, but it was an odd time for either activity. The building's administrative offices closed at 1700 hours, and the classified planning rooms required advanced scheduling and witness protocols for after-hours access. Rodriguez had learned early in her military career to trust her instincts. Growing up in East LA had taught her to pay attention to details that others might miss, the subtle changes in routine that often signaled bigger problems brewing beneath the surface. Her mother used to say, "Los pequeños cambios anuncian las grandes tormentas." Small changes announce big storms. It was a lesson that had served Rodriguez well both on the streets of her neighborhood and in the structured environment of military life. By Wednesday morning, Rodriguez had decided to dig deeper into the discrepancy. During her break, she accessed the base's personnel database to review Morrison's recent schedule and duty assignments. What she found made her increasingly uncomfortable. Over the past 3 months, Morrison had made numerous after-hours visits to various secure facilities around the base, always alone, always brief, and always with minor documentation irregularities that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a troubling pattern. The more Rodriguez investigated, the more convinced she became that something was seriously wrong with Morrison. His late-night activities coincided with several unexplained security incidents around the base. Nothing dramatic, just small breaches in protocol, minor equipment malfunctions, and occasional communication failures that had been attributed to routine technical problems or human error. But when viewed together through the lens of Morrison's irregular access patterns, these incidents began to look less random and more coordinated. Rodriguez knew she was venturing into dangerous territory. Morrison outranked her by several pay grades and had significant influence within the base's power structure. Accusing a field grade officer of misconduct based on circumstantial evidence would be career suicide unless she was absolutely certain of her facts. But she also knew that if Morrison was engaged in unauthorized activities that could compromise base security, the upcoming visit from General Hawthorne represented a critical opportunity to address the situation at the highest levels. The challenge was finding a way to bring her concerns to the general's attention without violating the chain of command or making accusations she couldn't prove. Rodriguez spent Wednesday evening in her barracks room reviewing everything she'd discovered and trying to find a clear path forward. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial. The pattern was concerning but not conclusive, and her position as a staff sergeant in base security gave her very little leverage in the face of a field-grade officer's presumed innocence. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made military ceremonies particularly impressive. General Hawthorne's convoy arrived at Fort Braxton at precisely 0800 hours, with Rodriguez and her security team providing perimeter coverage as the general and her staff were escorted to the base commander's headquarters for initial briefings. From her position at Checkpoint Alpha, Rodriguez watched as the general emerged from her vehicle, a compact woman in her early 50s whose bearing radiated the kind of confidence that came from 30 decades of military service and hard-earned respect. The morning proceeded according to the carefully planned itinerary. General Hawthorne met with Colonel Davidson, the base commander, for a comprehensive overview of Fort Braxton's mission and capabilities. She toured the training facilities, observed live fire exercises, and received detailed briefings on the base's operational readiness and resource requirements. Rodriguez monitored these activities from her various security positions, maintaining the professional invisibility that her role required while keeping her eyes open for any signs of the irregularities she'd been investigating. It was during the afternoon facility tour that Rodriguez first saw Morrison interact directly with General Hawthorne. The deputy operations officer had been assigned as one of the general's primary escorts, responsible for explaining the base's logistical operations and answering questions about resource allocation and efficiency measures. Rodriguez watched from her security post as Morrison guided the general through Building 7, the same facility where his unexplained late-night visits had been occurring. Morrison's demeanor during the tour struck Rodriguez as slightly off. Where other officers displayed the natural nervousness that came with briefing a three-star general, Morrison seemed overly confident, almost casual in his interactions with General Hawthorne. He answered her questions quickly and moved her through certain areas of the building with what appeared to be deliberate haste, particularly near the offices that housed sensitive financial and operational records. As the afternoon wore on, Rodriguez found herself paying closer attention to Morrison's body language and communication patterns. She noticed how he deflected certain questions from the general, redirected conversations away from specific topics, and seemed particularly eager to conclude the tour of Building 7. These observations, combined with her earlier discoveries about his irregular access patterns, strengthened her conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with the deputy operations officer's conduct. Thursday evening brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to the unfolding situation. Rodriguez was conducting her final security sweep of the day when she encountered Sergeant First Class Thompson, a 20-year veteran who worked in the base's communications center and had developed a reputation for knowing everything that happened at Fort Braxton before most people knew it themselves. "Rodriguez," Thompson called out as she passed his station near the communications building. "You got a minute?" She approached his position, noting the serious expression on his weathered face. Thompson had served 3 combat deployments and had earned the respect of personnel across all ranks for his professionalism and integrity. If you wanted to talk to her privately, it was probably important. "I've been watching you pay extra attention to certain people and places this week," Thompson said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "And I think you might be on to something that needs attention." Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. Had her investigation been that obvious? "What do you mean, Sergeant?" Thompson pulled out a small notebook and flipped to a page covered with dates and times written in his careful handwriting. "I've been tracking some communication irregularities over the past few months. Nothing that would raise red flags individually, but patterns that don't make sense when you look at them together. Late-night data transfers, unauthorized access to classified communication channels, and several instances of security protocols being bypassed in ways that should have triggered automatic alerts." As Thompson shared his observations, Rodriguez realized that his communications-focused investigation complemented her security-focused discoveries in ways that painted an even more troubling picture of Morrison's activities.
The colonel wasn't just making unexplained visits to secure facilities, he was also manipulating communication systems in ways that could compromise operational security and potentially facilitate unauthorized information transfers. The thing that really bothers me, Thompson continued, is that these irregularities have been escalating in frequency and sophistication over the past month, right around the time the base received notification of General Hawthorne's inspection visit. It's almost like someone is rushing to complete something before she arrives. Rodriguez shared her own discoveries with Thompson, and together they began to piece together a comprehensive picture of Morrison's suspicious activities. The pattern that emerged suggested that the deputy operations officer might be engaged in unauthorized intelligence gathering, or potentially even espionage activities that posed a direct threat to base security and national security interests. The question facing both NCOs was how to bring this information to General Hawthorne's attention without violating protocol or making accusations they couldn't definitively prove. They were enlisted personnel raising concerns about a field-grade officer, a situation that required careful navigation of military hierarchy and procedures. Friday morning brought the second day of General Hawthorne's inspection, with a focus on operational procedures and personnel management. Rodriguez was assigned to provide security coverage for a series of briefings in the base conference center, where various department heads would present their operational summaries to the general and her staff. It was during the mid-morning break between briefings that Rodriguez witnessed an interaction that convinced her that immediate action was necessary. As personnel filtered out of the conference room for coffee and restroom breaks, she observed Morrison engaged in what appeared to be an intense, whispered conversation with a civilian contractor who wasn't supposed to have access to the briefing areas without escort. The contractor was someone Rodriguez recognized but couldn't immediately place, a middle-aged man with government credentials who had been seen around the base occasionally over the past few months, but whose specific role or purpose remained unclear. Watching Morrison's body language during their brief interaction, Rodriguez noticed the telltale signs of stress and urgency that suggested this wasn't a casual professional conversation. When Morrison noticed Rodriguez observing them, his reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of acknowledging her presence with the professional nod that military protocol required, he quickly ended his conversation with the contractor and moved away from the area with obvious discomfort. The contractor, meanwhile, produced his credentials when Rodriguez approached and explained that he was conducting routine equipment maintenance, but his explanation didn't align with the maintenance schedule Rodriguez had reviewed as part of her security preparations. As the morning progressed, Rodriguez found herself in an increasingly difficult position. The evidence of Morrison's suspicious activities was mounting, but her role as base security personnel limited her options for addressing the situation directly. She couldn't simply approach General Hawthorne during a formal inspection without violating numerous protocols and potentially undermining her own credibility. The breakthrough came during the lunch break, when Rodriguez was assigned to security duty outside the officers' dining facility, where General Hawthorne was having a working meal with the base's senior staff. As she monitored the entrance, she overheard portions of a heated discussion between Morrison and another officer about timeline pressures and maintaining operational security that seemed to reference activities unrelated to the general's inspection. More importantly, she heard General Hawthorne's voice carrying through the partially open window, asking pointed questions about base security protocols and expressing concern about information management issues that had been flagged in preliminary reports. The general's tone suggested that she was already aware of potential problems at Fort Braxton and was actively investigating concerns that might align with Rodriguez's own discoveries. This revelation changed Rodriguez's perspective on the situation entirely. Rather than being a lone staff sergeant trying to raise concerns about a superior officer, she might be sitting on information that could directly support the general's own investigation into base security issues. The question was no longer whether to speak up, but how to do so effectively and appropriately.
Friday afternoon brought the kind of crisp military precision that made Fort Braxton look like a recruitment poster come to life. General Hawthorne's inspection schedule included visits to various operational units, with each department head eager to showcase their personnel and capabilities to the distinguished visitor. Rodriguez found herself assigned to provide security coverage for these tours, moving through the base in the general's wake while maintaining the professional invisibility that her position required. But invisibility, Rodriguez was beginning to realize, could be a form of power in itself. As the furniture of military operations, security personnel often witnessed conversations and interactions that participants forgot were being observed. Throughout the afternoon, she accumulated additional pieces of evidence that strengthened her growing conviction that Morrison was engaged in activities that posed a serious threat to base security. During the tour of the communications facility, Rodriguez watched Morrison guide General Hawthorne past certain equipment stations with obvious haste, offering explanations that seemed designed to minimize her interest in specific systems rather than provide comprehensive information. When the general asked detailed questions about data security protocols, Morrison's answers were evasive and technically imprecise in ways that suggested either incompetence or deliberate misdirection. More troubling was Morrison's reaction when General Hawthorne inquired about the base's procedures for monitoring after-hours access to classified facilities. Rodriguez saw him exchange a meaningful glance with Chief Warrant Officer Bradley, a communications specialist who had been present during several of the irregular incidents that Thompson had documented. The subtle communication between the two men suggested coordination that went beyond normal professional interactions. The afternoon's most significant moment came during the tour of Building 7's administrative offices. As the group moved through the facility, General Hawthorne paused at the entrance to the records management section and asked specific questions about document security and access protocols. Rodriguez's explanation of the procedures was technically accurate, but incomplete, omitting several important safeguards that Rodriguez knew were part of standard operating procedures. Colonel Morrison, the general said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the vicinity pay attention. I'd like to review the access logs for this facility over the past 3 months. Specifically, I'm interested in any after-hours entries and the corresponding documentation. Rodriguez watched Morrison's face carefully as he processed this request. For just a moment, his professional composure slipped, revealing a flash of genuine concern before he recovered his official demeanor. "Of course, General," Morrison replied smoothly. "I'll have those logs compiled and ready for your review first thing Monday morning." "I'd prefer to review them this afternoon," General Hawthorne said, her tone making it clear that this wasn't a negotiable request. "I'll be conducting a comprehensive security assessment, and current access patterns are an essential component of that evaluation." The tension in the room was palpable as Morrison realized he couldn't delay or deflect the general's request without raising suspicions. Rodriguez found herself holding her breath as she watched the confrontation unfold, knowing that Morrison's access logs would reveal the irregularities she had discovered earlier in the week. "Certainly, General," Morrison said after a brief pause. "I'll have those records pulled immediately. Should I coordinate with base security to ensure we have complete documentation?" It was a calculated attempt to involve additional personnel in the review process, potentially diluting the focus on Morrison's own access patterns by including data from multiple sources. But General Hawthorne's response suggested she understood the maneuver for what it was. "I'll want the complete records, but I'm particularly interested in any irregularities or discrepancies that might indicate security vulnerabilities or protocol violations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your base security. You'll be familiar with these access patterns and any unusual incidents that might not be reflected in the official logs." Rodriguez felt her heart rate spike as the general addressed her directly. This was the opportunity she had been hoping for, but it came with enormous professional risks. Contradicting a field-grade officer in front of a general could end her military career, but remaining silent about potential security threats could have even more serious consequences.
"Yes, ma'am," Rodriguez replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system.
I'm familiar with the access patterns for this facility. Morrison's eyes locked onto Rodriguez with an intensity that made his message unmistakable. Any deviation from the official narrative would have serious personal consequences. But General Hawthorne's presence in the room changed the power dynamics in ways that Morrison couldn't control through intimidation alone. "Good," the general said. "I'll want your assessment of any security concerns related to facility access, particularly any patterns that might indicate vulnerabilities or protocol violations." The die was cast. Rodriguez realized that she was being given a direct opportunity to present her concerns to the highest levels of military leadership. But she would need to do so in a way that was professional, factual, and unassailable. Morrison's glare made it clear that he understood the threat she represented, and his next words confirmed her assessment of the situation. "General, if I may," Morrison interjected, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is relatively junior in her security role, and she may not have the complete context necessary to interpret access patterns or identify legitimate operational requirements that might appear irregular to untrained personnel." It was a direct attack on Rodriguez's credibility and competence, designed to undermine her potential testimony before she could present it. But Morrison's transparent attempt to discredit her seemed to have the opposite effect on General Hawthorne, whose expression hardened as she processed the colonel's words. "Colonel Morrison," the general said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that Rodriguez had heard before when senior officers were pushed beyond their patience, "I'm perfectly capable of evaluating the credibility and relevance of information from personnel at all levels. In my experience, the most significant security vulnerabilities are often identified by the people who are closest to day-to-day operations, regardless of their rank or time in service." The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable, and Rodriguez felt a surge of gratitude toward the general for defending her right to contribute to the assessment. Morrison's face flushed slightly as he realized his attempt to preemptively discredit Rodriguez had backfired, potentially drawing more attention to whatever information she might provide. The tension in Building 7's administrative corridor was thick enough to cut with a bayonet as General Hawthorne's words settled over the small group. Rodriguez could feel Morrison's eyes boring into her, while the general's expectant gaze made it clear that evasion was no longer an option. This was the moment that would define not just her military career, but potentially the security of the entire base. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," General Hawthorne continued, "I want you to accompany us to the security office, where we can review these access logs in detail. Your familiarity with normal patterns will help me identify any anomalies that require investigation." As the group moved toward the security office, Rodriguez caught sight of Sergeant First Class Thompson near the communication station. Their eyes met briefly, and his subtle nod conveyed both encouragement and solidarity. Whatever happened next, Rodriguez knew she wouldn't be facing it entirely alone. The security office was a cramped space, lined with monitors, filing cabinets, and computer terminals that managed access control for the base's most sensitive facilities. Rodriguez had spent countless hours in this room reviewing logs, investigating minor incidents, and maintaining the detailed records that kept Fort Braxton's security apparatus functioning smoothly. Today, those same records would either vindicate her concerns or destroy her career. Morrison positioned himself strategically near the main computer terminal, clearly intending to control the narrative by managing what information was presented and how it was interpreted. But General Hawthorne had different plans for how the review would proceed. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the general said, "I want you to walk me through the normal access patterns for this facility, and then show me anything that strikes you as unusual or concerning. Take your time, and don't worry about rank or protocol. I need your honest, professional assessment." Rodriguez approached the terminal with hands that were steadier than she had expected. Months of quiet observation and careful documentation had prepared her for this moment, even if she hadn't fully realized it at the time. She began by displaying the baseline access patterns for Building 7, showing how different personnel typically access various areas during normal duty hours, and explaining the procedures that governed after-hours entry.
As you can see, General, her voice growing more confident as she settled into familiar territory, most after-hours access follows predictable patterns based on duty schedules, emergency responses, or pre-authorized maintenance activities. The system automatically flags any access that doesn't match established patterns, and those incidents are supposed to be documented and investigated. Morrison shifted uncomfortably as Rodriguez highlighted several flagged incidents from the past 3 months, each one representing an after-hours access that had generated automatic alerts but had been dismissed as routine administrative oversights. These incidents, Rodriguez continued, pointing to a cluster of flags associated with Morrison's access card, represent a pattern of after-hours entries that were flagged by the system but weren't properly documented according to standard procedures. Individually, they might be explained as administrative oversights, but collectively they suggest a systematic circumvention of security protocols. General Hawthorne leaned forward to examine the data more closely, her expression growing increasingly serious as she processed the implications of what Rodriguez was showing her. Morrison, meanwhile, prepared to defend himself against what he clearly recognized as a direct challenge to his conduct. General, Morrison interjected, those incidents can all be explained by legitimate operational requirements. As Deputy Operations Officer, I often need to access facilities outside normal hours to address urgent issues or retrieve time-sensitive documents. The documentation discrepancies are simply administrative oversights that don't reflect any actual security violations. But Rodriguez was ready for Morrison's defense, having anticipated that he would attempt to dismiss the irregularities as routine operational necessities. Sir, with respect, she said, addressing Morrison directly, the concerning aspect isn't just the frequency of after-hours access, but the pattern of your visits and their correlation with other security incidents around the base. Rodriguez pulled up additional data screens that she had prepared earlier in the week, cross-referencing Morrison's access patterns with the security incidents that Thompson had documented from his communications monitoring activities. Over the past 3 months, Rodriguez explained to General Hawthorne, Colonel Morrison's after-hours facility access has coincided with numerous communication irregularities, including unauthorized data transfers, bypass security protocols, and several instances of classified information being accessed outside normal channels. The correlation was undeniable, and Rodriguez could see from General Hawthorne's expression that the implications were not lost on the experienced officer. Morrison's face had gone pale as he realized the extent of the evidence that had been compiled against him. Furthermore, Rodriguez continued, yesterday afternoon I observed Colonel Morrison engaged in an unauthorized meeting with a civilian contractor who didn't have proper escort documentation for access to the briefing areas. When I approached to verify the contractor's credentials, both individuals displayed behavior consistent with conducting unauthorized activities. Morrison's composure finally cracked under the weight of Rodriguez's methodical presentation of evidence. His voice carried a sharp edge as he attempted to regain control of the situation through intimidation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, he said, his rank and authority evident in every syllable, you are making serious accusations based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. Your interpretation of routine administrative activities as sinister conspiracies demonstrates exactly the kind of inexperience and poor judgment I was concerned about.
But General Hawthorne raised a hand to silence Morrison before he could continue his attack on Rodriguez's credibility. Colonel Morrison, the general said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from 3 decades of military leadership, I'm less concerned about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's experience level than I am about the patterns she's identified. In my experience, junior personnel often notice important details that senior officers overlook, particularly when those senior officers have personal interests in maintaining certain narratives. The implication was clear. General Hawthorne was taking Rodriguez's concerns seriously and was prepared to investigate them thoroughly, regardless of Morrison's attempts to discredit the messenger. The atmosphere in the security office had shifted dramatically in the space of 15 minutes. What had begun as a routine inspection briefing had evolved into something that resembled an interrogation, with General Hawthorne methodically examining evidence that painted an increasingly troubling picture of Colonel Morrison's activities. Rodriguez found herself in the surreal position of briefing a three-star general on security vulnerabilities while the suspected perpetrator stood just feet away. His authority within the base hierarchy suddenly rendered meaningless by the weight of documented evidence and the general's obvious concern about what she was discovering. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," General Hawthorne said, "I want you to show me the specific communication irregularities that correlate with these access patterns. And I want to understand exactly what kind of information could have been compromised if someone was indeed conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering activities." Rodriguez coordinated with Thompson, who had been summoned to provide his communications expertise to the impromptu investigation. Together, they presented a comprehensive picture of how Morrison's facility access aligned with sophisticated attempts to bypass communication security protocols and potentially extract classified information. "The pattern suggests," Thompson explained to the general, "that someone with detailed knowledge of our security systems was systematically testing vulnerabilities and exploiting gaps in our monitoring capabilities. The timing and sophistication of these activities indicate an inside operator with significant technical knowledge and administrative access." Morrison's desperation was becoming increasingly apparent as the evidence mounted against him. His attempts to explain away the irregularities were growing less coherent and more defensive, while his body language betrayed the stress of maintaining a fabricated narrative under intense scrutiny. "General Hawthorne," Morrison said, his voice strained with barely controlled panic, "I want to state clearly for the record that these allegations are based on misinterpretation of routine activities and speculation by personnel who lack the security clearance and contextual knowledge necessary to understand legitimate operational requirements." But the general's response made it clear that Morrison's deflection tactics were no longer effective. "Colonel Morrison," she said, "I've been conducting security assessments for more than a decade, and I've learned to distinguish between legitimate operational activities and unauthorized conduct. What I'm seeing here suggests systematic security violations that pose a direct threat to this installation and potentially to national security interests." General Hawthorne turned back to Rodriguez with an expression that conveyed both respect and expectation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, based on your investigation and the evidence you have presented, what is your professional assessment of the security threat posed by these activities?" It was the question Rodriguez had been preparing for throughout the week, but hearing it asked directly by a three-star general in the presence of the officer she was essentially accusing of misconduct made the gravity of the moment almost overwhelming. "General," Rodriguez replied, her voice steady and professional, "based on the documented evidence and observed patterns, I believe Colonel Morrison has been conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering activities that have compromised the security of classified information and created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors." The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. Rodriguez had just directly accused a field-grade officer of what amounted to espionage activities, basing her assessment on weeks of careful investigation and documentation. Morrison's reaction was immediate and explosive. "This is absolutely outrageous," he shouted, his professional composure completely abandoned. "I have served this country faithfully for 15 years, and I will not stand here and be accused of treason by some junior enlisted security guard who doesn't understand the first thing about real military operations." But his outburst only served to reinforce the credibility of Rodriguez's assessment. General Hawthorne's expression hardened as she watched Morrison's emotional breakdown, recognizing the signs of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling under pressure.
"Colonel Morrison," the general said, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade, "you will lower your voice and maintain proper military bearing, or you will be removed from this facility immediately." The threat was not idle. Rodriguez could see military police personnel moving into position outside the security office, clearly responding to signals from General Hawthorne's staff. The situation had escalated beyond a routine inspection into what appeared to be a serious security investigation with potential criminal implications. Morrison seemed to realize that his position was no longer tenable. His shoulders sagged as he processed the reality that his activities had been discovered and documented by personnel he had dismissed as irrelevant. When he spoke again, his voice carried the resignation of someone who understood that his military career was effectively over. "General Hawthorne," he said, "I request the opportunity to speak with you privately before any formal actions are taken." It was a tacit admission that Rodriguez's accusations had merit, and everyone in the room understood the implications of Morrison's request for private consultation. "General Morrison," the general replied, "you will have the opportunity to present your version of events through proper channels. But first, I need to ensure that any ongoing security vulnerabilities are immediately addressed and that all potentially compromised information is secured." General Hawthorne turned to Rodriguez with an expression that conveyed both gratitude and respect.
Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your investigation has potentially prevented serious damage to national security interests. I want you to work with my staff to ensure that we have complete documentation of all security irregularities and that appropriate remedial measures are implemented immediately. For Rodriguez, the moment represented a validation of everything her mother had taught her about speaking truth to power and refusing to accept that her voice didn't matter. But she also understood that the real test would come in the aftermath, when the immediate crisis had passed and the long-term implications of her decision to speak up would shape the rest of her military career. The next few hours transformed Fort Braxton into something resembling a crime scene investigation rather than a routine military installation. General Hawthorne's staff worked with military precision to secure potential evidence, interview key personnel, and establish the full scope of Morrison's unauthorized activities. Rodriguez found herself at the center of an operation that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. A staff sergeant directing aspects of a counterintelligence investigation involving a field-grade officer. General Hawthorne had immediately contacted the base's Criminal Investigation Division and coordinated with military intelligence specialists to ensure that the investigation followed proper procedures and maintained the integrity of any evidence that might be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Morrison had been placed under administrative restriction while investigators determined the extent of his activities and whether additional personnel might be involved in the security violations. Rodriguez was assigned to work directly with Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Chen, a military intelligence specialist from General Hawthorne's staff who had extensive experience in counterintelligence operations. Chen's approach to the investigation was methodical and comprehensive, treating Rodriguez not as a junior enlisted witness, but as a key investigator whose insights were essential to understanding the full scope of the security breach. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Chen explained as they reviewed the accumulated evidence, "your documentation and analysis have provided us with an excellent foundation for this investigation. What I need now is your help in identifying any other personnel who might have been involved in these activities, either as willing participants or as unknowing accomplices." The question forced Rodriguez to consider aspects of the situation that she hadn't fully explored during her initial investigation. Morrison's activities had been sophisticated enough to suggest either extensive technical knowledge or assistance from specialists in communications and information systems. The possibility that other personnel might be involved transformed what appeared to be an isolated incident into a potential conspiracy with broader implications for base security.
Working through the evidence systematically, Rodriguez and Chen identified several individuals who had been present during key incidents or who had access to the systems and facilities that Morrison had been exploiting. Chief among these was Chief Warrant Officer Bradley, the communications specialist whose meaningful glance with Morrison during General Hawthorne's tour had caught Rodriguez's attention. Bradley has been involved in several of the communication irregularities that Sergeant Thompson documented, Rodriguez explained to Chen. His position gives him the technical expertise needed to bypass security protocols and manipulate data transfers in ways that might not be detected by routine monitoring. Chen made detailed notes as Rodriguez walked her through the evidence linking Bradley to Morrison's activities. The pattern that emerged suggested a coordinated effort involving at least two individuals with complementary skills and access privileges, raising serious questions about how long the unauthorized activities had been ongoing and what information might have been compromised. The investigation took on new urgency when Chen's team discovered that Morrison's access patterns extended beyond Fort Braxton to include suspicious communications with external contacts who couldn't be immediately identified through military channels. The possibility that classified information had been transmitted to unauthorized recipients transformed the security investigation into a potential espionage case with national security implications. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hawthorne said during a late afternoon briefing, "I want you to understand that your investigation has uncovered what appears to be a serious breach of national security. The evidence you've compiled will likely be crucial in any legal proceedings that result from this investigation." The weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying for Rodriguez. In the space of a single week, she had evolved from a routine security guard to a key figure in a counterintelligence operation that could have far-reaching consequences for military security procedures and potentially for international intelligence activities. As the investigation continued into the evening, additional evidence emerged that confirmed Rodriguez's initial suspicions and revealed the sophisticated nature of Morrison's operation. Digital forensics specialists discovered encrypted files on Morrison's government computer that contained detailed information about base security procedures, personnel assignments, and operational schedules that had no legitimate connection to his official duties. More troubling was the discovery that Morrison had been systematically photographing classified documents and storing the images in hidden directories on his computer. The documents included detailed intelligence assessments, operational plans, and personnel security files that represented exactly the kind of information that foreign intelligence agencies would find extremely valuable. "The scope of this breach is significant," Chen explained to Rodriguez and General Hawthorne during an evening briefing. Morrison had access to classified information across multiple departments and appears to have been systematically collecting and organizing materials that could compromise ongoing operations and personnel security. Rodriguez listened to the briefing with a mixture of vindication and growing concern about the implications of what had been discovered. Her initial observation of a missing signature had led to the uncovering of what appeared to be a sophisticated espionage operation that had been ongoing for months and potentially involved multiple personnel.
The evening brought an unexpected development when Bradley was brought in for questioning and immediately requested legal counsel, suggesting that he understood the serious nature of the accusations against him. His refusal to cooperate with the investigation without legal representation confirmed Rodriguez's suspicions about his involvement in Morrison's activities. This is developing into a complex case with multiple suspects and potential foreign intelligence connections, General Hawthorne explained to Rodriguez. Your role in identifying and documenting these security violations has been absolutely crucial, and I want you to know that your professional conduct throughout this investigation has been exemplary.
As Friday evening turned into night, Rodriguez reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed her routine security duties into participation in a major counterintelligence operation. The validation from General Hawthorne and her staff was gratifying, but Rodriguez also understood that the most challenging aspects of the situation were still ahead.
Saturday morning brought new revelations that expanded the investigation far beyond Fort Braxton and into the realm of national security concerns that would ultimately involve federal law enforcement agencies and international intelligence organizations. Rodriguez found herself briefing FBI counterintelligence specialists who had arrived overnight to assist with what was now being treated as a potential espionage case with foreign intelligence connections. The digital forensics team had worked through the night to analyze Morrison's computer systems and encrypted files, uncovering evidence of regular communications with individuals whose identities suggested connections to foreign intelligence services. The sophisticated encryption methods and communication protocols indicated that Morrison's activities were part of a larger intelligence operation rather than an isolated case of unauthorized information gathering. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Special Agent Martinez from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, explained, "The evidence you helped uncover has led us to identify what appears to be a long-running intelligence operation that extends beyond this installation to potentially include multiple military facilities and civilian defense contractors. The scope of the investigation had expanded to include surveillance of communication networks, financial records analysis, and coordination with international intelligence partners to identify the foreign entities that had been receiving classified information from Morrison's operation." Rodriguez's initial security investigation had opened a window into a sophisticated espionage network that threatened national security interests at the highest levels. Working with Agent Martinez and Chief Warrant Officer Chen, Rodriguez helped identify patterns in Morrison's activities that suggested coordination with external handlers who had provided specific guidance about what information to collect and how to transmit it securely. The level of sophistication involved in the operation indicated professional intelligence training and resources that went beyond what a single disgruntled military officer could have developed independently. The communication patterns show that Morrison was receiving specific taskings from external contacts, Chen explained to the investigative team. These weren't random intelligence gathering activities. They were targeted operations designed to collect specific types of classified information that would be valuable to foreign intelligence services. The discovery that Morrison had been operating under external direction raised serious questions about how he had been recruited, how long the operation had been ongoing, and whether other military personnel at Fort Braxton or other installations might be involved in similar activities. The investigation team began conducting comprehensive security reviews of all personnel who had access to the classified information that Morrison had been collecting. Rodriguez found herself working closely with Agent Martinez to identify potential security vulnerabilities that had enabled Morrison's operation to continue undetected for months. Her detailed knowledge of base security procedures and her systematic approach to identifying irregularities proved invaluable in helping the investigative team understand how the security breaches had occurred and what measures would be needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. "Your approach to this investigation has been exactly what we need in counterintelligence work," Agent Martinez told Rodriguez. "You identified patterns, documented evidence, and maintained objectivity while dealing with a situation that could have had serious personal and professional consequences if you had been wrong." The investigation took on international dimensions when communications intercepts revealed that information from Morrison's operation had been shared with intelligence services from at least 2 foreign countries, potentially compromising ongoing military operations and diplomatic initiatives. The FBI and military intelligence agencies began coordinating with allied intelligence services to assess the damage and implement countermeasures to protect compromised sources and methods. As the scope of the case became clear, Rodriguez began to understand the full significance of her decision to investigate the initial security irregularities she had noticed. What had seemed like minor administrative oversights had actually been indicators of a sophisticated espionage network that posed serious threats to national security and international relationships. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hillthorne said during a Saturday afternoon briefing, "I want you to understand that your investigation has potentially prevented significant damage to national security interests and has helped identify vulnerabilities that exist at military installations across the country." The general's words carried weight that extended beyond professional recognition. Rodriguez's investigation had contributed to a broader understanding of how foreign intelligence services were attempting to penetrate military security systems and collect classified information through the recruitment and manipulation of military personnel. The investigation team discovered that Morrison's operation was part of a larger intelligence network that had been systematically targeting military installations with significant research and development activities, advanced weapons systems, and strategic planning capabilities. Fort Braxton had been selected because of its role in testing new communications technologies and training programs that would be implemented across the military. By Saturday evening, the investigation had resulted in the identification of at least 6 other military installations where similar security irregularities suggested the presence of additional intelligence operations. FBI and military intelligence investigators were coordinating simultaneous operations to investigate these facilities and identify any personnel who might be involved in unauthorized intelligence gathering activities. Rodriguez's role in the investigation had evolved from local security guard to consultant on a national security case that would likely influence military security procedures and counterintelligence training programs for years to come. Her systematic approach to identifying and documenting security irregularities was being used as a model for security personnel at other installations who were conducting similar reviews of their own facilities. "The impact of your work extends beyond Fort Braxton," Agent Martinez explained to Rodriguez. "The methods you use to identify and investigate security vulnerabilities are being incorporated into training programs that will help security personnel at installations across the country recognize similar threats." As the weekend investigation continued, Rodriguez reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in her understanding of her role and responsibilities as a military security professional. What had begun as routine duty assignments had evolved into participation in a counterintelligence operation that would shape her career and influence national security procedures.
Sunday morning brought the news that Rodriguez had been both anticipating and dreading. Morrison's legal counsel had negotiated a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, and the colonel had agreed to provide detailed information about his intelligence activities in exchange for reduced charges and a plea agreement. The development meant that the full scope of the espionage operation would finally be revealed, but it also meant that Rodriguez would likely be called upon to testify in legal proceedings that could extend for months or even years. The cooperation agreement had immediate implications for the ongoing investigation. Morrison's detailed confession confirmed that he had been recruited by foreign intelligence operatives more than 2 years earlier and had been systematically collecting classified information from Fort Braxton and other installations where he had been assigned. His activities had compromised operational security, personnel information, and technological developments that represented significant intelligence victories for hostile foreign governments. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hawthorne explained during a Sunday morning briefing, "Colonel Morrison's confession has confirmed the accuracy and importance of your investigation. Without your systematic documentation of security irregularities, this espionage operation might have continued for months or years, potentially causing immense damage to national security interests." The validation was gratifying, but Rodriguez found herself thinking beyond the immediate satisfaction of being proven correct about her suspicions. The investigation had revealed systemic vulnerabilities in military security procedures that went far beyond the specific activities at Fort Braxton, raising questions about how similar operations might be conducted at other installations and what changes would be needed to prevent future security breaches. Morrison's confession also revealed the sophisticated methods that foreign intelligence services were using to recruit and manage military personnel who had access to classified information. The operation had involved financial incentives, personal blackmail, and psychological manipulation techniques that highlighted the need for enhanced security training and monitoring procedures across the military. The methods used in this case represent evolution in foreign intelligence operations, Chief Warrant Officer Chen explained to the investigative team. Traditional recruitment techniques have been supplemented with sophisticated psychological profiling and targeted approaches that exploit personal vulnerabilities and financial pressures that military personnel might be experiencing. Rodriguez's role in the investigation had provided her with insights into counterintelligence operations that went far beyond her original training and experience. She had worked directly with FBI agents, military intelligence specialists, and international law enforcement officials who were coordinating responses to what was now understood to be a multinational intelligence operation with implications for allied nations and ongoing military operations around the world. The investigation team had identified at least 12 other military personnel at various installations who appeared to have been targeted for recruitment by the same foreign intelligence network that had operated Morrison. The systematic approach used by the hostile intelligence service suggested extensive resources and long-term planning that posed ongoing threats to military security even after Morrison's operation had been shut down. This case has demonstrated the importance of vigilant security practices at all levels of military operations, Agent Martinez explained to Rodriguez. Your systematic approach to identifying irregularities and your willingness to pursue concerns despite potential professional risks represent exactly the kind of security awareness that we need to combat sophisticated intelligence threats. Sunday afternoon brought the moment that would define Rodriguez's military career and establish her reputation in the intelligence and security communities. General Hawthorne had requested a comprehensive briefing on the investigation's findings, and she wanted Rodriguez to present the security aspects of the case to a distinguished audience that included senior military officers, FBI officials, and representatives from allied intelligence services. The briefing would be Rodriguez's opportunity to demonstrate her analytical capabilities and professional competence to an audience whose opinions could significantly influence her future career opportunities. More importantly, it would be her chance to contribute to the development of improved security procedures that could prevent similar intelligence operations from succeeding in the future. As Rodriguez prepared for the briefing, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a week earlier, she had been a routine-based security guard whose opinions were rarely solicited and even more rarely valued. The investigation had transformed her into a recognized expert on security vulnerabilities and counterintelligence procedures whose insights were sought by senior officials at the highest levels of military and law enforcement organizations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hawthorne said as they prepared for the briefing, I want you to understand that this presentation represents more than just a case summary. Your analysis and recommendations will influence security procedures at military installations across the country, and potentially in allied nations as well. The responsibility was both thrilling and intimidating. Rodriguez knew that her presentation would be scrutinized by officials whose experience and expertise far exceeded her own, but she also understood that her unique perspective as the initial investigator gave her insights that others might not possess. The briefing room was filled with personnel whose ranks and positions represented the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Rodriguez had never addressed such a distinguished audience, but her preparation and confidence in the evidence she had compiled helped her maintain professional composure as she prepared to present her findings. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hawthorne announced as she called the briefing to order, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez will be presenting the security analysis that led to the identification and investigation of this espionage operation. Her systematic approach to identifying irregularities and her professional competence in conducting this investigation have been exemplary throughout this process.
The briefing room fell silent as Rodriguez stepped to the podium, facing an audience that included 2 general officers, 3 FBI supervisory special agents, representatives from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and liaison officers from Allied Intelligence Services. The weight of the moment was unmistakable. Her presentation would influence security policies and procedures that could affect military operations for years to come. Rodriguez had spent the early morning hours reviewing her notes and organizing her presentation to ensure that she could clearly communicate the complex series of events that had led to the discovery of Morrison's espionage operation. Her systematic approach to the investigation had generated comprehensive documentation that told a complete story of how security vulnerabilities had been identified, investigated, and ultimately addressed. General Hawthorne, distinguished guests, Rodriguez began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the audience she was addressing. I want to present the security analysis that identified systematic vulnerabilities in our facility access protocols and led to the discovery of unauthorized intelligence gathering activities that posed significant threats to national security. The presentation began with Rodriguez's initial observation of irregularities in Building 7's access logs, the missing signature that had first caught her attention and prompted her to investigate further. She explained how that single discrepancy had led to the identification of patterns that suggested systematic security violations rather than isolated administrative oversights. The key to this investigation, Rodriguez explained, was recognizing that individual security irregularities, while seemingly minor, could indicate larger patterns of unauthorized activity when viewed systematically over time. The challenge was distinguishing between routine administrative errors and indicators of deliberate security violations. Rodriguez's presentation methodology impressed the audience of senior officials. Her systematic approach to evidence collection, her objective analysis of patterns and correlations, and her professional presentation of findings demonstrated analytical capabilities that exceeded what might typically be expected from a staff sergeant with limited counterintelligence training. Agent Martinez had told Rodriguez privately that her investigative approach was being studied by FBI training specialists who were developing new curricula for counterintelligence education programs. The combination of attention to detail, systematic documentation, and willingness to pursue concerns despite potential professional risks represented qualities that were essential for effective security operations. As Rodriguez continued her presentation, she addressed the broader implications of the security vulnerabilities that had enabled Morrison's operation to continue undetected for months. Her analysis had identified specific weaknesses in monitoring procedures, documentation requirements, and supervisory oversight that had created opportunities for unauthorized activities to occur without triggering appropriate investigative responses. The systematic nature of these security violations, Rodriguez explained to the audience, suggests that our current monitoring procedures may be inadequate for detecting sophisticated intelligence operations conducted by personnel with legitimate access privileges and detailed knowledge of our security systems. The presentation included specific recommendations for procedural improvements that could enhance security monitoring capabilities and reduce vulnerabilities to similar intelligence operations in the future. Rodriguez's suggestions were based on her detailed understanding of how Morrison's operation had exploited existing gaps in security procedures and her analysis of what additional safeguards might have detected the unauthorized activities earlier. General Hawthorne interrupted the presentation at several points to ask detailed questions about Rodriguez's analytical methods and the evidence that had led to specific conclusions. The general's questions were clearly intended to demonstrate Rodriguez's competence and professionalism to the distinguished audience, while also ensuring that the investigation's findings could withstand scrutiny from officials who had extensive experience in intelligence and security operations. General Hawthorne asked, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, what was the most significant factor that enabled this espionage operation to continue undetected for such an extended period of time? It was the kind of analytical question that could define Rodriguez's credibility with the audience. Her answer would need to demonstrate not just knowledge of the specific case, but broader understanding of security principles and intelligence operations that went beyond her formal training and experience. Rodriguez considered her response carefully, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of everything she had learned during the investigation, and potentially the most important professional statement she would make in her military career. The room remained silent as officials waited for her response.
General Hawthorne's expression conveyed confidence in Rodriguez's capabilities, but also expectation that her answer would meet the professional standards required for such a distinguished audience. Rodriguez could see Agent Martinez and Chief Warrant Officer Chen in the audience, both of whom had worked closely with her throughout the investigation and understood the quality of her analytical work. Their presence provided reassurance, but Rodriguez knew that her response would need to stand on its own merits. Colonel Davidson, the base commander, was also present in the audience, a reminder of the institutional hierarchy that Rodriguez had effectively challenged through her investigation. His expression was neutral, but Rodriguez understood that her presentation was being evaluated not just for its technical accuracy, but for its implications about leadership and oversight responsibilities at all levels of the military organization. The moment had arrived for Rodriguez to demonstrate that her investigation represented more than lucky observations and routine security procedures. She needed to articulate insights that would justify the confidence that General Hawthorne and other senior officials had placed in her analytical capabilities and professional judgment as Rodriguez prepared to respond to the general's question. She understood that her answer would likely be remembered and quoted in intelligence training programs and security policy discussions for years to come. This was her moment to contribute meaningfully to the broader conversation about military security and counterintelligence operations.
The silence in the briefing room was profound as Rodriguez processed General Hawthorne's question about the most significant factor that had enabled Morrison's espionage operation to continue undetected. Every person in the room, from the FBI supervisory special agents to the Allied intelligence liaison officers, waited for her response with the kind of attention reserved for moments when junior personnel are given opportunities to influence senior-level decision-making. Rodriguez understood that her answer would need to address not just the technical aspects of security vulnerabilities, but the deeper institutional and cultural factors that had created an environment where systematic security violations could occur without detection. The investigation had revealed problems that went beyond individual misconduct to include broader issues of oversight, accountability, and organizational culture that affected security operations throughout the military. General, Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed throughout her participation in the investigation. The technical security vulnerabilities were certainly significant factors in enabling this operation. The gaps in our monitoring procedures, the inadequate documentation requirements, and the insufficient oversight of after-hours facility access all contributed to creating opportunities for unauthorized activities. She paused, organizing her thoughts as she prepared to address what she believed was the more fundamental issue that had enabled Morrison's operation to succeed. However, Rodriguez continued, I believe the most significant enabling factor was institutional. Specifically, our organizational culture's tendency to dismiss or undervalue observations and concerns raised by personnel who are perceived as junior or whose roles are considered peripheral to core operations. The statement drew visible reactions from several officials in the audience. Rodriguez could see that her analysis was resonating with people who had extensive experience in intelligence and security operations and understood the cultural dynamics she was describing. Throughout my investigation, Rodriguez explained, I discovered that several personnel had noticed irregularities or suspicious activities related to Colonel Morrison's conduct, but they had been discouraged from pursuing their concerns or had been told that their observations were not significant enough to warrant investigation. General Hawthorne leaned forward with obvious interest as Rodriguez continued her analysis. The systematic nature of this espionage operation succeeded not just because of technical vulnerabilities, but because it exploited our institutional tendency to defer to rank and authority, rather than encouraging thorough investigation of security concerns, regardless of who raises them or what their position might be within the organizational hierarchy. Rodriguez could see that her analysis was having an impact on the audience. Agent Martinez was taking detailed notes, while the DIA representatives were exchanging meaningful glances that suggested her observations aligned with their own experiences in intelligence operations. In my opinion, Rodriguez continued, the most effective counterintelligence measure we could implement would be creating institutional cultures that actively encourage personnel at all levels to report security concerns and that treat those reports with professional seriousness regardless of the rank or position of the person making the report. General Hawthorne nodded approvingly as Rodriguez concluded her analysis, but then asked a follow-up question that would prove to be the decisive moment in the entire presentation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the general said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades making decisions that affected thousands of military personnel. You've identified institutional culture as a key factor in this security failure. But changing institutional culture is one of the most difficult challenges that any organization faces. If you were given the authority to implement one single policy change that could address this cultural issue, what would it be? The question was both an opportunity and a test. General Hawthorne was asking Rodriguez to move beyond analysis into the realm of policy recommendation, to suggest specific institutional changes that could prevent similar security failures in the future. It was the kind of strategic thinking that was typically expected only from senior officers and policy specialists. Rodriguez knew that her answer would need to be both practical and transformative, specific enough to be implementable, but comprehensive enough to address the fundamental cultural issues she had identified. The room remained silent as she considered her answer, understanding that this moment would define not just her own career trajectory, but potentially influence security policies across the military. General, Rodriguez said, her voice steady and confident, if I could implement one policy change, it would be this. Security concerns must be investigated regardless of who reports them. The 7 words hit the room like a thunderclap. Security concerns must be investigated, regardless. The simplicity and power of the statement silenced every person in the briefing room, from the most senior general officer to the most experienced intelligence analyst. General Hawthorne's expression reflected both surprise and admiration as she processed the implications of Rodriguez's recommendation. The policy statement was simultaneously simple and revolutionary. It would fundamentally alter the way military organizations approach security reporting and investigation procedures. Regardless of who reports them, regardless of their rank, regardless of their position, regardless of their time in service, and regardless of whether the reported concern involves personnel who outrank the person making the report. The 7-word policy statement had captured the essence of everything that Rodriguez had learned during her investigation. The systematic security failures that had enabled Morrison's espionage operation had succeeded precisely because concerns and observations from junior personnel had been dismissed or discouraged rather than investigated thoroughly. Agent Martinez looked up from his notes with an expression that conveyed both professional respect and recognition that Rodriguez's recommendation represented a fundamental insight into counterintelligence operations that went beyond the specific case they had been investigating. That policy change, Rodriguez explained, would create institutional incentives for personnel to report security concerns rather than ignore them, and it would ensure that potential security violations are investigated based on the evidence rather than the organizational politics surrounding who reported them or what their position might be within the organizational hierarchy. General Hawthorne stood up from her chair, a gesture just that brought everyone else in the room to attention as they recognized that the briefing had reached a significant conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hawthorne announced to the assembled officials, what we have heard today represents exactly the kind of analytical thinking and policy insight that our security organizations need at all levels of operation. The general's words carried the weight of formal recognition that Rodriguez's contribution to the investigation had exceeded all expectations and had produced recommendations that would influence security policies far beyond Fort Braxton. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hawthorne continued, addressing her directly, "Your 7-word policy recommendation, security concerns must be investigated regardless, will be forwarded to the Pentagon for consideration as a standard operating procedure across all military installations." The impact of that announcement was immediate and profound. Rodriguez realized that her investigation had evolved from a local security matter into a national policy recommendation that could affect security operations throughout the military. The 7 words she had spoken in that briefing room would potentially be implemented as official policy governing how security concerns were reported and investigated across thousands of installations worldwide. Agent Martinez approached Rodriguez after the briefing concluded, carrying a folder that contained what appeared to be official documentation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, "the FBI would like to offer you the opportunity to participate in our counterintelligence training programs. Your analytical approach and investigative methods have impressed our specialists, and we believe you could make significant contributions to our educational curricula." The offer represented a career opportunity that Rodriguez had never imagined possible when she first noticed Morrison's missing signature in the Building 7 access logs. In less than a week, she had evolved from a routine base security guard to a recognized expert whose insights were valued by federal law enforcement agencies and senior military leadership. Chief Warrant Officer Chen joined the conversation with her own professional recognition of Rodriguez's contributions to the investigation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Chen said, "I've worked counterintelligence cases for 15 years, and I've rarely seen such systematic analytical work from personnel at any level of experience. Your approach to this investigation should be taught as a case study in intelligence training programs." But the most significant recognition came from General Hawthorne herself, who approached Rodriguez privately after the other officials had departed. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the general said, "I want you to understand that what you accomplished this week goes far beyond solving a single security case. You've demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking and professional courage that the military needs in its security and intelligence operations." The general handed Rodriguez an official document that would change the trajectory of her entire military career. "This is a recommendation for immediate promotion to Sergeant First Class," the general explained, "along with orders transferring you to a specialized counterintelligence unit where your skills can be developed and utilized more effectively." The promotion and transfer represented validation of everything Rodriguez had worked toward since enlisting in the military. More importantly, they represented recognition that her voice and her insights had value that extended far beyond her original role as base security personnel. Additionally, General Hawthorne continued, "I'm recommending you for the Army Commendation Medal for your outstanding performance during this investigation. Your systematic observation to identify security vulnerabilities and your professional competence in conducting counterintelligence operations have been exemplary." As the day concluded, Rodriguez reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in her understanding of her own capabilities and potential contributions to military operations. The investigation had revealed not just Morrison's espionage activities, but her own analytical abilities and professional courage that she hadn't fully recognized before. The 7 words that had silenced the briefing room, "security concerns must be investigated regardless," would become the foundation for new security policies that could prevent similar intelligence operations from succeeding in the future. But more than that, they represented a fundamental principle about the value of every person's observations and the importance of institutional cultures that encourage rather than discourage security reporting. 3 months later, Rodriguez received word that her policy recommendation had been adopted as official procedure across all military installations and had been shared with allied nations as a best practice for counterintelligence operations. The 7 words she had spoken in that briefing room had literally changed the way military organizations around the world approach security investigations. The transformation was complete. Rodriguez had evolved from
only base security to a recognized expert whose insights influence policy at the highest levels of military and intelligence operations. But perhaps more importantly, she had demonstrated that in professional organizations, the most significant contributions often come from people who are willing to speak truth to power and who refuse to accept that their observations don't matter. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Your voice matters not because of where you sit, but because of what you have to say. The investigation had proven that principle in the most dramatic way possible, showing that sometimes the most junior person in the room has the most important insights to offer. Rodriguez's story became a case study taught in military academies and intelligence training programs, demonstrating how systematic observation, professional courage, and analytical thinking could uncover security threats that might otherwise go undetected. But for Rodriguez herself, the most important lesson was simpler. Every voice matters, every observation has potential value, and sometimes the most powerful statement you can make consists of just 7 words that change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.